When you think about the climate crisis and who is disproportionately impacted, definitely, people of color, queer people, but also people with disabilities. For example, in disaster relief, like if we just think about whose lives are being valued, whose lives does the government deem worth protecting, and it's definitely not people with disabilities.
Hi everyone, this is Aletta, founder and creative director of Our Climate Voices. Climate Change is Personal is our new podcast, where we're listening to people's personal experiences with the climate crisis and learning from their wisdom about how to create a future that is resilient, community-based, and centers the leadership of people on the front lines of the crisis. For those of you who are new to Our Climate Voices, we are a collective led by young, queer and trans folks, BIPOC, and disabled people working to humanize the climate crisis, catalyze systemic change, and vision the future that we want to make real. We know that climate change at its core is a social justice issue rather than an individual consumer problem. We also know that the oil and gas industry and other powerful interests have profited off of climate lies for decades and invested in strategies to convince us to fight climate crises as individuals rather than as a collective. Those in power know that we are more powerful together, and they are afraid of us acting collectively. So, we mobilize our personal experiences with climate change to hold those who profit from the climate destruction accountable, and we share our collective wisdom about how to embody a resilient, interdependent, and just future.
Today, we're here with the thoughtful Alexia Leclercq, a French and Taiwanese 21-year-old community organizer working at the intersection of climate justice and disability justice in Texas. Alexia is passionate about bringing awareness to the disproportionate harm that climate change causes people of color with disabilities, particularly mental disabilities, which are often overlooked even in disability justice spaces. Climate change is personal to Alexia because they have experienced how climate change grief, fear, and anxiety exacerbate disability. Alexia is a fierce advocate for people with disabilities leading in the climate movement and the wisdom that their communities have around effective advocacy. Alexia, thank you for your time today. We can't wait to hear your story.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexia. I am 21 years old, and I use she, they pronouns. I am French and Taiwanese, and I grew up in many different places, but I moved to the U.S. when I was 8. And I'm currently a community organizer at Poder, which is a social and environmental justice nonprofit in East Austin. And I've kind of been involved with Poder for a couple years now. I was also involved with Youth Climate Strike and Sunrise Movement. As a young person living in our current world, the climate crisis is definitely something very much real and something that, is in the back of my mind. I think especially having family from Taiwan and actually going back there pretty often, there's been an increase in like hurricanes and earthquakes in the past few years. I think the last time I went back, I was there for a month and there was 2 hurricanes. And it's just definitely something that is real and that is already happening. And that could, in the future, really, really exacerbate and impact me. The climate crisis is something that's very present, that's, constantly already impacting the island. In Taiwan, we've seen like an increase in hurricanes. I've had, family members had to evacuate. And it's just something that, we know is going to get worse in the future. And also the heat has significantly gone up, and death by heat is actually something very common, especially in older populations. And it's not something that you usually think about that much when you think about the climate crisis, but it's like a very serious concern. And also just like over the years, seeing how polluted it has become, just like from the creek that was behind my grandparents' house, or just like looking at urban decay is pretty bad where my family's from. When you think about the climate crisis and who is disproportionately impacted, definitely, people of color, queer people, but also people with disabilities. For example, in disaster relief, like if we just think about whose lives are being valued, whose lives does the government deem worth protecting, and it's definitely not people with disabilities. I think one of the core ways in which they're related for me comes down to capitalism, because when you think about capitalism at its crux, it's like, a system where you're trying to accumulate wealth through the exploitation of land and labor. And there's a very both racialized and there's a hierarchy within this global system of who is considered normal and who is criminalized. And disability is definitely criminalized. It's seen as behavior that's threatening and that's non-normal. And capitalism kind of sees people with disabilities as disposable, and capitalism at the same time also, causes the climate crisis through its continuous exploitation of land. And so when you really dig down to what is the systemic root of like some of these issues that we see, like climate justice and disability justice are very much intersectional and cannot be seen as separate. Capitalism is a system that, causes the climate crisis because it advocates for the continuous exploitation of the environment to make money. And at the same time, in capitalism, it's a very ableist system because it prioritizes people without disabilities, and it basically dictates what is considered normal behavior, and what is considered normal behavior is usually like based on your productiveness in society. And so capitalism doesn't advocate for, everyone. It advocates for everyone contributing the maximum possible to society at their own detriment of their own personal health. When you think about the climate crisis and who is disproportionately impacted, people with disabilities are one of the groups of people that are left behind, whether that's, in a disaster relief plan. A lot of times people with disabilities aren't included. If you think about, if there's a hurricane, who's going to go where? Are there like transportation systems that are accessible? People who need medication to survive, like where would I get meds if suddenly there's like a natural disaster? The climate crisis is actually causing an increase in mental disabilities. Sometimes it exacerbates already existing mental disabilities, and other times, like traumatic events like natural disasters, or just like, not having a healthy environment surrounding you can cause an increase in mental health crisis. Race has been a very important factor, in both disability justice and the climate movement, and just all my experiences. I think personally, especially in the psychiatric institution, I've had a lot of experience that, like, looking back was definitely extremely racist, just like people's preconceived notion about like my culture or who I am. There's actually an article that was written by my friend Natalie Crystal, who's a Black disabled writer, and she talks about the work of another author who was talking about how people of color, even those who aren't disabled, can be seen as disabled because they're associated with like disorderly action, which, is both, it is a way that disability is like criminalized. And I think I've experienced a lot of like people who I enter the space and they have preconceived notions of like what's going through my mind or how I'm going to react and whether that's going to be violent. And then they, as a precautions, inflict violence upon me because they think I'm going to be threatening just based on the way that I look. And I think that's, race is always a huge factor in everything in the disability space and also in the climate space. Oftentimes the psychiatric institutions are kind of part of the carceral state. Personally, I've had the experience of like the cops being called on me and being forced to go somewhere. And that's, a very terrifying experience that many people, especially people of color, people have been killed just by having someone call 911 on them for being in a mental health crisis. And I think that even though at first to me it didn't actually seem that my issues with with mental health issues were directly connected to the climate crisis, it wasn't until later that I understood that it's really part of the same issues. Like if you think about, Indigenous people protesting for pipelines and the way they're treated by the police, and, people getting murdered by the police, that's the same system that's causing that. That is also causing people with disabilities or people in a mental health crisis to be killed by the cops. I think one of the experiences that I have, had multiple times is just sitting in an office and trying to, explain what I'm feeling right now, whether that's with a therapist or with a psychiatrist or whoever, and not being listened to and immediately seen as like I am a threat to myself or I'm a threat to like the community, even though I haven't actually said anything that is alarming based on they have different requirements, right? If they think you're gonna hurt someone or hurt someone else, that's when they really take action. But the way they determine that is very much tied to race, and is very much tied to their perceived idea of like who you are, just based on like how you enter and like them knowing about your background or your disability. And I've definitely seen different treatment between like, having a white therapist or having a person of color be my therapist. And it's just really been eye-opening to know how much perceived, like how much you are perceived as a threat makes in their minds, like really impacts what decision they're going to take next. People with disability aren't believed a lot of times. Like, it's something that's happened to me and I know have happened to other people. And I think part of this is this idea that if you have a disability, you don't know, you're not normal, you don't know as much about what you need, and someone else needs to tell you or protect you or decide what is right for you, when a lot of times people with disabilities know what they need. If someone is in crisis, and is a person of color, they might be perceived as threatening and, might be arrested or might be shot. Like there's, countless cases where people of color have called 911 just because they were going through a mental health crisis and were actually killed. And so that could very much be a situation that would happen in, some type of like climate crisis, like a heat wave or a natural disaster, etc. And, people with disabilities are disproportionately killed by the police. Like 50% of, people that have been killed by the police do have some type of like neurodivergent case. Some of the things that I've learned about non-physical disability is that, it's valid, and a lot of times physical and mental disabilities are also tied, and people, certain people experience both. And I think I'm glad that like in the most recent years, especially with like younger generations, I've seen a bigger acceptance of like, different things like depression, anxiety, but I think there's still a lot of stigma around other mental disabilities. And I think people oftentimes don't accept it as much as like a real disability. But actually a lot of the issues are similar. So if you think about, for example, disaster relief, like with people with mental disabilities, that might mean like access to medication. And then that might mean like, what is the response? Because obviously that's a very stressful situation that could cause someone to go into crisis. And so what help is available after someone goes into crisis? And then we've also seen that with increase climate crisis, there's actually increased anxiety around the issue, but also PTSD from these traumatic events, or if you've lost family members in different climate disasters. And even just, not being able to have access to like clean water or like, food and all these basic rights, or, housing and all of that, like can very much lead to, increased mental instability. Some of the things that I wish that non-disabled people knew or did in the climate movement include first understanding the intersections between the climate crisis and disability justice, and then including people with disabilities in these spaces and in leadership positions, and different people, because, there's such a wide range of disabilities, and I can only personally speak on my experiences, and I cannot speak for someone else who has a different disability. So including a wide range of people. And then the second thing is to be really mindful of the space that people are creating in the climate movement area, and like not perpetuating harmful environments. This includes like, making content accessible, making events accessible. These are very small things that sometimes are forgotten. And then also, like, with the entire movement, not replicating harmful capitalistic rhetorics of like overworking yourself, not valuing mental health. And so I think that's really important to understand how disability justice has to happen within the climate movement space as well. People with disability bring a lot of wisdom to the climate justice movement. I think personally speaking from my experience, just having to deal with everything that I've dealt with, I've learned a lot of skills in terms of like advocating for myself, and also kind of being forced to like want to create change because, when you face injustices, you're kind of forced into a position where you're like, okay, let me figure out how I can organize. Let me figure out what I can do to change something. People with disabilities like know what they need for themselves. And so I think if we're looking to advocate for disability justice in the climate space, we have to have people with disabilities lead that. When I think about a world with climate and disability justice, honestly, it's kind of hard to imagine it. But I think one of the most important things is like, while we make progress, to always like continue imagining the possibilities. So I think for me, I see not a global system, but different local community-centered systems. So this would look different in Taiwan than, say in the Congo or in the US. The forms of governance would look very different and would be based on, either like local indigenous traditions or just community-centered form of governance. But I would definitely see a global world that respects nature and sees us as not separate from nature, but as like stewards of nature and part of nature. And I would see a world that, values people with disabilities and has a community-centered peer system to support people with disabilities.
Hello again, this is Kari Slaughter, Director of Design at OCV. Thank you all for listening, and thank you, Alexia, for taking the time to share your experiences with us today. Thank you to Aletta Brady for interviewing Alexia. As usual, I had a great time mastering and scoring this episode, and my life was made a lot easier thanks to editing support from Taylor Medley and Abby Haley. Our beautiful cover art was made by Cindy Santana. As always, a massive thank you to the rest of the OCV team for their consistent and valuable support to our dedicated community. If you want to engage further with OCV, you can find us on Instagram at Our Climate Voices or on our website at www.ourclimatevoices.org. Stay tuned for 2 more episodes about the intersections of disability justice and the climate crisis in the coming months. See you then.